With the NBA season coming up, I wanted to make sure I fully understood how I see each of these teams coming up this season. Who are the worst teams? Who are the best teams? What tiers would I put each of them in? Who are the true top tier contenders and who are maybe towards the bottom of the league? Let's start at the bottom, the D tier, the bottom tier of the league. These are, in my opinion, the worst teams in the NBA going into this upcoming season. They all belong in the same tier, and that tier begins with the Washington Wizards. This should not be a surprise to really anyone, because when you already are not a great team and then you lose Bradley Beal, yes, they get some stuff in exchange. They do so have some decent players there. Guys like Kyle Kuzma, maybe it's Jordan Poole comeback season, but just from a talent perspective, in terms of the direction of their franchise, where they're trying to go, what they're trying to do, I think they're definitely one of the worst teams in the league and a bottom tier team. Joining them in that bottom tier is also the Charlotte Hornets. Now, some of you might try and make an argument that Charlotte should be up a tier here, just because generally speaking, they seem to win more games than we realize on a year-to-year basis. They have the talent of guys like LaMelo. Bridges is going to be back. Kyle Washington is going to be back, but the talent around LaMelo is just not good enough, and his main skill is, you know, setting other players up, making those guys better, and when the talent isn't there around him, I do certainly think they are still one of the worst teams in the league. Joined as well in this tier by the Detroit Pistons, an intriguing team, an up-and-coming team, and depending on how good Cade Cunningham is this year in his return from injury, they certainly could be a higher tier up than this, but given how bad they were last year, how bad they were in Cade's rookie season, and yes, they have some interesting young players on this roster, but none of them are proven at the NBA level yet, and so to just bet on Cade coming off of missing an entire season due to injury, I think I do have to put them in this bottom tier. And then rounding out this tier, I have the Portland Trailblazers. Now, this is assuming post Damian Lillard trade. As of the recording of this video, he is still a member of the Trailblazers, but if we're operating under the assumption that it's going to be a Scoot Henderson, Anthony Simons led team with some other veterans, assuming they keep some of those guys, Jeremy Grant, things like that, I do still think this is going to be one of the worst teams in the league for a couple of reasons. One, I would expect that even if they do have guys like Jeremy Grant, Jusuf Nurkic on the roster to begin the season, they're either not going to play a ton because they don't want to win games, or in Nurkic's case, they're probably going to try and move those guys at the deadline. There is absolutely no incentive for this team to win, and even though I really like Scoot and I like Anthony Simons, depending on what they get back in exchange for Damian Lillard, the assumption is it's going to be a lot of draft picks. I just don't think that they're going to be a very good team this year. Next up in the C tier, the next tier of teams from worst to best, I have the San Antonio Spurs in this group. They do have some young talent on the roster. Of course, they're going to have Wemby as a rookie this year, and there are scenarios in which I can envision them maybe being like a 35 or a 40 win team with Greg Popovich as the coach, really trying to push to make sure that they are some kind of competent in terms of wins. But from a talent perspective, they're still just lacking too much for me, despite Wemby and Keldon Johnson, those other guys there as well. I don't think they're going to play Wemby nearly as much as maybe it's assumed at the moment, and it's definitely going to be kind of a developing year still for San Antonio, so I'm going to put them in the C tier. Joined in that tier with them are the Houston Rockets. Now, obviously, they made some moves this offseason to try and improve the roster, to try and be better than this, but I still see this as a team that finds itself in this kind of group. When you look at the other teams that they're paired with in this tier, they don't belong, you know, in that tier lower down, because they did add guys like Fred VanVleet, Dylan Brooks, in addition to the young talent that they have, but I don't think that they're good enough to be in this upper tier as well. That's how I do these rankings. You go in your kind of section, and then you can, you know, interchange these teams however you'd like to within these individual groupings. Houston, even though I do think they're going to be improved in a very tough Western Conference, I find it really hard to believe that they're going to win like 40 games or something. And if you're not a team that I see as a real playoff contender, it's hard to put you any higher than this in the rankings. Similar story for the next team here, and that is the Indiana Pacers. Of course, I love Tyrese Halliburton. I love Benedict Mathurin. Miles Turner is still there. They've got some interesting pieces. But again, when you look at, can they really be a true playoff contender? I have some questions about that, not to mention the fact that this is a team that might not really want to win too much this year. They've added some pieces this offseason, but to me, not enough to put them in that next level. And then rounding out this tier is the Orlando Magic, a team that I want to be good, a team that I certainly could see, you know, winning 40 games, maybe pushing for the postseason, but there's just too much unknown still in Orlando, even as good as Franz Wagner is, even as good as Paolo is. I have question marks in terms of how much the new guys that they brought in as rookies are really going to be able to help this team. I have questions in terms of their spacing still, in terms of their backcourt as well. Love the young talent. I think they're going to continue to grow and improve, but for this season in particular, they belong much more in this tier than the tier that we're going to talk about coming up. Which gets us now to the B tier. And from here on out, every single team that we're going to talk about they're going to be in the mix in the postseason, very solidly in the mix, unless there's some kind of injury or something unexpected happens to their team midway through the season. It makes sense to project them as a team that is going to be competing for the postseason, not just, oh, we might maybe get to the 10th seed and have a play-in game, but actually competing for a top 8 seed in either conference. And that begins with the Utah Jazz. I thought about putting them in the C tier, but the more that I thought about the way that they began the year last year, they do have a ton of talent on this roster. The coaching staff did a really good job last year, and I would not be surprised to see them finish 8 or higher, even in a very loaded Western Conference. I think Utah is going to be good. They certainly belong in this tier rather than the group underneath them. Joined in that tier with them is the Dallas Mavericks, and there's probably people watching this video thinking that they should be either, probably in the A tier, right? They should still be a competing team. They've got Kyrie, they've got Luka. They're going to have one of the best offenses in the league. I still have major question marks about how that pairing is going to work, as well as defensively. The thing that has made Dallas successful in the Luka era has been, let's really rely on Luka offensively and try and put together a top 10, a top 12 defensive group. And they just don't have that this year, nor did they have that last year. And as long as you're still going to be one of the 10 worst teams in the league defensively, no matter how good your offense is, I have real questions about putting you up any higher than just kind of the middle line of the NBA, which is, I think, about where Dallas is going to finish this year. But again, kind of a theme with this category, I do see some upside there. I could see Dallas finishing as a top 4 team. I don't think it's likely. They do have that level of talent, but I'm going to keep them in this B tier. Next up on the list, kind of similar in that like potential kind of category, the Minnesota Timberwolves. And I've talked a little bit about them recently in terms of what their roster should or shouldn't look like moving forward. And if they're fully healthy, there's certainly an argument to be made that they should be up higher than this. And again, I do think that there's a scenario in which maybe they are a top 4, a top 5 team in the Western Conference, but it's much more likely that they find themselves more in that 6 to 8 range, despite what I'm expecting to be another leap from Anthony Edwards, despite hopefully health between Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert. This to me is just a team that isn't quite as complete as the other teams in the tier above them. Moving on now to the Oklahoma City Thunder. Maybe you're surprised to see them here. I think that they are one of the most talented young teams in the entire league. And this was a team that was in the play-in hunt last year. And so it certainly seems like if they continue to grow and develop with all these young players, of course, Chet actually playing this season, they should be a team in the hunt for a top 8 seed in the West. I love Oklahoma City this year, and I cannot wait to see what they look like. SGA, Josh Giddey, Chet Holmgren, Jalen Williams year 2. It's going to be a really fun group. And again, the West is loaded, but I definitely think that the Thunder belong in this kind of category, in this kind of tier. Also in this tier are the Atlanta Hawks. I struggled with them as well as the next couple of teams because the middle tier of teams in the Eastern Conference is really difficult to figure out who's going to rise up and who's going to kind of fall back a little bit. But because of the talent that they do have there in Atlanta between Trae Young and DeJounte Murray, obviously shuffling the roster a little bit this year, getting rid of someone like John Collins, assuming that they're healthy, I couldn't put them down in like the Orlando category. They kind of had to be in this tier, as did the Toronto Raptors, the Chicago Bulls, and the Brooklyn Nets, all of which I'm going to put to finish out the B tier here. This is what I'm talking about with the middle of the Eastern Conference. Any one of these teams could finish 4th. Any one of these teams could finish 10th, or even worse than that in the case of a team like Chicago. The Nets are still transitioning into this new era post KD and Kyrie. Mikal Bridges obviously was great for them at the end of last year. You have no idea what you're going to get from Ben Simmons, but post KD trade last year, they were an under 500 team, which means that they need to be either in the B tier or maybe even lower than that. Chicago, I have no idea. There's talent there, but you have no idea if they're going to be healthy. And without Lonzo Ball healthy, this Chicago team has just been like right around 500 throughout this entire era. And without him healthy again this year, that's right where I expect them to be. And then Toronto, they lose Fred VanVleet in the offseason. Yes, they've got Pascal Siakam. Yes, they've got Scotty Barnes, but I don't know what they're going to do with that backcourt apart from hoping that Dennis Schroeder is going to be good for them. All those teams to me, Atlanta, Brooklyn, Toronto, and Chicago, all kind of fall into the same group in the middle of that Eastern Conference, and that is why they round out the B tier. But we move on now to the top, kind of upper echelon of the NBA. These are teams that if things go well, you could see competing for a title. You could see any one of these teams in the conference finals for their respective teams. They're not the true top of the league, which is obviously going to be the S tier. That's only a couple of teams. But from this point on, every single one of these teams I could see representing their conference in the finals or making the conference finals, and I wouldn't be surprised at all. And that tier begins with the Memphis Grizzlies. And it's a team that from a regular season perspective has been incredibly successful over the last couple of seasons. Struggle a little bit in the postseason. Obviously, they have to deal with the Ja suspension to begin this season, but they have Desmond Bane. Jaren Jackson Jr. is still very good. They bring in Marcus Smart. They get rid of Dillon Brooks. They're changing up the roster. They're trying new things, and I could certainly foresee a scenario in which Memphis finally breaks through in the postseason and gets to either the conference finals or the finals. And given that reality, they need to be in the A tier, in my opinion. Also in the A tier, next up for them is the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, if the Harden situation had been resolved or Harden had been re-signed, I would have really thought about putting the Sixers in the S tier, because say what you want about, their postseason struggles and things like that, but they were one game away from beating Boston, potentially having the opportunity to beat Miami to go to the finals. It was a real thing. They were right there. They missed their opportunity, but Joel Embiid's still one of the best players in the league, and the only reason they're in the A tier is because I have no idea how they're going to resolve the Harden situation. And as much as I like Tyrese Maxey, he cannot one-for-one replace what James Harden provides to this team, and so they are still in the A tier for me. Next up in the A tier is the Sacramento Kings. Now, there's going to be plenty of predictions this year people are going to have about the Kings, you know, kind of falling off. They were the surprise team last year. Maybe it was a little bit of a fluke. I think from a talent perspective, they are just as good as they showed last year, certainly from a record standpoint. And with De'Aaron Fox, Domantas Sabonis, all the other guys that they have there, they should continue to improve. They might not finish as well in the standings as they did last year, but they are definitely a team to be reckoned with in the West. And again, I could see them in the conference finals, and that is why they're in the A tier. Also in the A tier with them is the LA Clippers. I know that the injury stuff continues to be an issue for them, but if I'm going into the season assuming that maybe this is the year that the Clippers are finally healthy from a talent perspective, depth, all that different stuff, they have to be in the A tier. They would be kind of like, if I put them in the same category as like Brooklyn and Chicago, that wouldn't really make any sense. And so I felt like they fit way better with this group in this A tier. And again, if you're ranking things by tiers, all the teams together need to make sense. And from an upside perspective, I think the Clippers certainly still belong in this A tier, although it's unlikely that they will actually remain healthy for the entire season. Miami is also going to be in this A tier. The Heat, I know that it's weird given how they finished in the regular season last year. It's especially weird because, again, as of the recording of this video, Damian Lillard is not on the Heat. We expect that he will be at some point, and if they do add him, maybe you can make the argument for them to be in the S tier, or certainly a much stronger argument for them to be in the A tier. But when you just went to the finals and are bringing back basically the same team, obviously they lose guys like Gabe Vincent, Max Strus, but the main pieces, Bam, Jimmy Butler, potentially also adding Damian Lillard, I can't realistically put you down there in a category like Brooklyn that, like I said, post KD trade last year was an under 500 team. So this is kind of where Miami has to be, in my opinion. The Lakers are also going to be in this category, a team that I could see competing for a title this year if healthy. Really like what they did in the offseason, and with continued health from LeBron and Anthony Davis, fingers crossed, they could honestly even be able to make an argument based off how well they performed post trade deadline last year after they mixed up the roster. You could maybe even make an argument for them to be higher up than this in the tiers. I also put the New Orleans Pelicans here, and this one might be a bit of a stretch because of obviously the injury issues that you're always concerned about with Zion and with Brandon Ingram, but just from a roster perspective, they have the talent to be a conference finals team, and if they are healthy, I think that is certainly a ceiling that they could reach. Obviously, that's always going to be a question for them. Golden State is also going to be in the A tier. Again, it's kind of like Miami. I can't put them down in a category with like Brooklyn, Chicago, those kinds of teams. They still have Steph, brought back Draymond, they have Clay, they're changing things around with the Chris Paul trade. Not an S tier team, but certainly still a contender. Then I'm going to finish out this tier with maybe two surprising teams in the Eastern Conference, Cleveland and New York. Both the Cavs and the Knicks I have in this A tier because, again, they didn't make sense with the previous tier. It's almost like we needed one in between these two. I kept it here anyway just because I could easily see a scenario in which Cleveland or the Knicks make the conference finals. They are in a different category in the Eastern Conference than teams like Brooklyn, Chicago, Toronto that we talked about in the previous tier, and they're probably on the lower end of this A tier, but they're both very good. I think both of them defensively are going to continue to get to, you know, put up really good stats and advanced numbers and things like that. Both these teams could be competing in the conference finals, and that's why they're in the A tier, which brings us to the top tiers we go into the season. These are the four best teams in the entire league, in my opinion. Phoenix, Boston, Milwaukee, Denver. I don't think there are any teams in this A tier that as we go into the season, unless you want to put a team like Miami there post Damian Lillard trade, I don't think there are any teams in the league that are close to these four. There is a significant gap between these four and the rest of the league. There are still question marks for each of these teams. Milwaukee is a team that is getting older, that continues to deal with injury issues, but because of how good Giannis is, because of how good they still are every single year in the regular season, no matter the circumstances, I do still have to put them in the S tier. Boston obviously had a weird year last year. You can have question marks about the coach, but from a roster perspective, they might be the most talented team in the entire league. Of course, now adding Kristaps Porzingis, changing some things up, getting rid of Marcus Smart, but an incredible roster led by Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Phoenix, I understand that their offseason was weird, but the more I think about it, the combination of talent on the perimeter that they have, in addition to having a legitimate big in DeAndre Ayton, I can't foresee a scenario in which they're not one of the best teams in the West. If they're healthy, then of course Denver, they just won the title. Question marks for them in terms of guys that left, losing out on Bruce Brown, lots of depth that they lost out on in the offseason, but it's still Jokic, it's still Michael Porter Jr., it's still Jamal Murray, and they did just win the title. They have to be in the S tier. All of this is subject to change as the season gets going, but this is where I see every single one of these teams in the NBA this year in terms of what tier they fall into.